Delighted to have you here today and delighted to have Dawn Tripp back with us. Dawn is a Massachusetts-based novelist. She was educated at Harvard and is the author of 3 published novels. She was here last July with Game of Secrets, we have there on the table, which is part literary thriller, part love story. It's set in a small town on Buzzards Bay. And today she is here with an earlier novel, The Season of Open Water. It won the Mass Book Award for Fiction and was selected as the town-wide community read in Dedham earlier this year. I understand they had a number of fun events that tied in with the theme with prohibition and speakeasies. The Season of Open Water opens in the fall of 1927, and it's a coming-of-age story for Bridge Weld. She's 19 years old, strikingly beautiful, and she's equally at home in her grandfather's boat building shed, on the open water, or stealing from the local grocer. The book covers a period of change in the country and in the Weld family. Almost a decade into Prohibition, Bridge's older brother Luce gets involved in the rum-running trade, and he tries to pull Bridge into that with him. Both their mother and grandfather are still struggling with grief from losing their spouses, and they seem powerless to stop the momentum that propels Luce and Bridge closer to danger. It's a story of desire for love, money, and power, and how those very things, love, money, and power, can either unite or divide us, but ultimately offer little protection from ourselves. Readers who've enjoyed The Game of Secrets will find Dawn Tripp's same poetic, flowing prose in The Season of Open Water, and all will be brought to a very precise time and place where a nation and a young girl are on the brink of big changes. Please help me welcome Dawn Tripp.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out today. It's great to see all of you here. And Dawn, thank you so much for having me back to the Concord Bookshop. I love this independent bookstore, this particular independent bookstore. It's just a special place. You know, it has a really amazing feeling here, which is what, to me, it's kind of the epitome of what an independent bookstore is, in the way that it puts books into the hands of readers. And for me, growing up, I loved bookstores and I loved libraries because I always felt, with every spine, turned, just the spine, every spine of a book on a shelf was a world. And to me as a child and as an adult now, there's no greater adventure than a story. So I'd like to say just a little bit about The Season of Open Water and the genesis of that book. As Dawn said, it won the Massachusetts Book Award for Fiction, and that meant a great deal to me, not just for the for the prestige of the award, but also because when they presented it to me, I was told that they felt that it wasn't just because of the story, the story of the novel, that they felt, that it was the right book for the award, but also because they felt that I had captured something that was inimitably true to the working culture and history of Massachusetts in the not so distant past. And that's really what I've tried to capture in all 3 of my novels that are out, is something true not only to that, to the physical geography of a place, but also the human geography of a place and that kind of undefinable essence that infuses the life of a small town as a result of the lives that have played out there. So Season of Open Water centers around a blue-collar family that gets drawn into the rum-running trade during the late years of Prohibition. My novels start with a spark, usually just with a little tiny fragment. And the idea for Season of Open Water came to me while I was researching for my first novel, Moontide. And Moontide follows 3 women from the summer of 1914 to the Great New England Hurricane of 1938. It's also set in Westport, Massachusetts, which is the town where I live. And it spanned that period of rum running. And rum running in Westport, like rum running in many small New England towns, it was it was a real part of the culture, of the town and the history of the towns of Massachusetts during the 20s. So I developed a subplot for Moontide, which centered around the rum running trade. And growing up, I had heard stories about rum running. I had heard stories of fishermen who took their small boats, out to the motherships that were anchored in Rum Row, and then zoomed, the crates of bootleg back to barns on the Westport River, and then farmers who would truck the same crates of bootleg to sell in the cities. And it was estimated by locals that I interviewed that half the town was in on it in some way, shape, or form, and the other half drew their shades and looked the other way. Because I think for a small town that's always has had a very independent spirit, there was something about the regulation of prohibition. They balked at it. They didn't think of it as, the lawlessness felt like common sense to them because the regulation just didn't make intrinsic sense to what they believed was right or fair, or the place of government to go and impose on people. So as I was researching for the rum running subplot in Moontide, I came upon a book. It was called The Black Ships. It's by Everett Allen, and it was the only nonfiction account that I could find of rum running during the 20s that was set in the South Coast that really told local stories. And on page 229, in The Black Ships, there's a reference, one sentence, to a young girl, unnamed, or a young woman unnamed, who used to ride shotgun with the rummies. And I read that line, and I thought, I want that to be my next book. That's the story. The story of that unnamed young woman is the story that I want to tell. So that then became The Season of Open Water. And when I began to dig in and research for a novel that is all about the rum running trade, I found that apart from Everett Allen's book, there's nothing written about it. There's a few books that are out there from the point of view of the Coast Guard. That wasn't particularly useful to me. And so what I found is I actually needed to go and interview local people, local families, who either people who remembered that period of time because they were very young during that period of time, or people whose family, there's one man who actually just passed away this past summer. I spent hours with him. His father was a huge rum runner and used to go up to Nova Scotia, back down here, used to travel down to Florida, and he would tell me story after story after story about, what his father did and his involvement. And that there was like 4 or 5 different, families that I spoke to. There are also some families in Westport who, one family in particular I'm thinking of who was one of the central families involved who doesn't speak about it, and that was a door that I just never went to knock on because I'm not out to tell anyone else's story. Really what I try to do in my novels is I try to listen and absorb and kind of transmute those stories that I'm told and then recast them, in a fictional setting through a fictional family and then create, a story that comes to life on the page. So, like I say, these stories aren't the stories. These stories in the novel are not the stories, that actually took place. But I do feel that particularly with this novel, even more than my other 2, the stories that I was told, because so much of the research for this novel came out of that oral exchange of stories. They've infused a certain unmistakable life into this particular fiction. So I'm going to read just a few passages, short passages, and then if at any time between readings, I'd love to take any questions. So if you have a question either about a reading, if you have a question about the creative process, if you have a question about this book or any other book, or what it's like to write a story about rum running and live in the same town where the book is set and realize that the book is coming out in that same small town, feel free. So this is from the prologue. This novel, actually like my other 2 novels, is told third person, shifting point of view. So it's told from a number of different perspectives. And so the story evolves in almost a mosaic way where you're getting different sides of the story, as the story is unfolding through time. And this is the prologue. Noel remembers it this way. It was the season of open water. of breeding, spawning, rooting, of thaw, a season brief, sudden, extravagant. They had rounded the Cape, climbed halfway up the Pacific, then heaved to at Lahaina. They restocked the slops, casks of salt pork, fresh fruit, water, flour. They breamed the bottom of the hull, added another layer of oak sheathing to the bow, and continued north in search of whales. They spotted 2 early on, took them both, and had no luck for over a month. They scoured the North Pacific grounds and shied into the fringes of the Arctic, through 72 Pass, the Bering Strait, and up along that uncertain coast toward Icy Point. It was 1868. Noel was 17. He had the strength of lions in his hands. With the other ship's carpenter, he stripped the resin pitch off the whaleboats and repainted the hulls white so they would seam into the ice. As he worked, he kept one eye skinned to the horizon, and still the ship pressed on, adrift for weeks through the endless daylight, the moon like an unfinished thumbprint lasting through the sky. The season of whaling in the Arctic was brief. The ice melting, the water opening, the earth began to ripen, flowers busting up out of the tundra earth, blue-spiked lupin, wild crocus, yellow poppy. The pack ice split to floes, and the trout ran thick through the hard, fast streams. Caribou, ptarmigan, lemmings, jaegers, terns. The sunlight blinding off the glaciers made their eyes ache, and still they cruised. As the leads widened, the snow softened out, and the water rushed over the ice. They sailed west in the morning, east in the afternoon, tacking back and forth through the floes, waiting for some sign of the whale they had come to hunt, waiting for a slick or a spout, a fin or a blow. They listened for her call, that low and telling sound, a slow bellow. They waited for the black warp of her back to break out of a drift. Once as they came upon a flat meadow of ice, the whiteness exploded up and took itself to wing, not ice at all, but a raft of snow geese. The birds pulled together into shoals, their wings hammered through the sky above the ship. Every man of the crew stopped his work and watched them, their barking cries shattering the stillness. When he thinks back on it now, Noel remembers that he had loved the tedium, the haunting vacancy of days, the queer indifferent light, the slow drift among the rotting bergs. But that same tedium made the other men restless. It needled them. They knew they had little time to do what they had come to do. The Arctic was a ruthless place, a treacherous and God-forsaken place. Its lull was fragile. The wind could seize up, a gale blow in. On an instant, the ice could freeze and lock behind them. The waiting made the men edgy, feverish and cruel. They picked at one another, broke out in fights. They did not shave. They did not stop work on Sundays. Then they spied the walrus pod, the mothers breaching with their young. They set upon them. They killed 400 in 2 days, an unthinkable number. They slaughtered them. The cows screamed, clutching their pups under their flippers as they died and were hoisted on deck. They yielded little, but the men strained the meat for what oil could be rendered. They worked them through until the pod was taken and the water turned black and red, their carcasses drifting like a city of the dead through all the seas around them. Now more than half a lifetime since, and still every night, Noel dreams of the sea, but not of this. He does not dream of this. And then the novel shifts to October 1927. And you might wonder, why choose a scene of whaling, to open a book that's really about rum running? And one reason is because I'm a whaling freak. and another reason is because when I first come to my novels, they come to me again, in these fragments, but the characters slip out not fully formed, but closer, to form than the story itself. And that, I had read about that incident with the walrus, which is a true incident that took place. And it felt to me, it had the same kind of tone and tenor of what rum running became towards the late years of Prohibition. I mean, it became controlled by big city syndicates. It became about greed. It became about a certain lawlessness and doing things for the sake of the violence, for the violence of doing them, as opposed to, for the reasons you might have started out doing them in the first place. And so Noel, there's 3 main characters in this novel, or 4 actually. And one is Noel, who is an 80-something-year-old old whaler who's now a boat builder. and his two grandchildren, Bridge, who's 19, and then Luce, who's 21. And Luce, when Luce gets drawn into the rum running trade, and Noel, he is powerless to stop him, but not entirely, and he doesn't stop him. And that whole experience of, what Noel went through, with the walruses, has a certain, impact and an echo in terms of how the rum running story in the present time, or in October 1927, unfolds.
I have to say how powerful that was.
Oh,
I mean,
thanks.
It's killing me right now.
Oh, thanks.
I just really feel it in my chest, that vision of the black waters and like a city moving onto itself.
Yeah.
Really powerful.
Thank you. That was a piece that, I think as probably many of you have heard, most writers that I know, in fact, every writer I know, you don't just sit down on page 1 and then just, zoom, to page 320. Writing is probably 20%, inspiration, 80%, sweat, and, keeping yourself at your desk and to the chair and reworking. That piece came out of me, all of one piece. That really just kind of came, and it came early. I don't necessarily write my books in order. I usually write an ending early on, but that particular piece came very, very early, so that it frames, the telling of the story, and really there was never any other place to put it but at the very beginning. Any questions, or should I read another small section? Yeah? Okay. So in the early, I'm just going to give you a little bit of story. Noel, who's the boat builder, the grandfather, is approached by a group of local rum runners to refit a boat, an old boat, for the rum running trade. And he kind of weighs it, like, does he really want to get involved in this? Because he knows it's now the late years of Prohibition, late years of rum running, things have become a little more cutthroat. Does he really want to take on that risk, that possibility for danger? He doesn't like the leader of the local band, Honey Lions, who's asking him to do this, but he takes the job because he feels that the money that he'll make from this one job is as much as he'll make in a year, and it's an opportunity for him to build some kind of future for his grandchildren, and specifically Bridge, who he adores. And Bridge is the young woman that Dawn alluded to early on, who's really the center of the novel, who is a bit of a tomboy and a petty thief. And I got taken to task on that at the Dedham Reads. There was this older man, he was so nice. He's like, I loved Bridge. I loved her so much, but you made her a thief. Like, why did you do that? I'm like, well, that's just what she does. Yeah. So this is a chapter. Noel has refitted the boat for the trade, but what he doesn't see coming is that the person the rummies are really after is actually Luce. Who's the grandson, because he's the one that really knows the river, and because he has an edge. He's got a dark side to him, and Honey Lion sees that, and sees that this is something that he can shape and exploit. So Luce gets drawn into the rum running trade and is trying to pull his sister into it with him. And Cora is their mom. I think at this point that's all you need to know. So twice that fall, when Cora and Luce were alone in the kitchen, Luce dug some money out of his pocket, pushed it at her, and said gruffly, "There, Ma, go and buy yourself something fine." But there was nothing that she wanted, nothing she would need. She kept the money, though, in an empty hat box on the upper shelf of her closet, where she kept a few other necessary things. She can feel the rupture between her father, Noel, and her son, the stilted, tenuous peace. They had never fit together well, she knows this, never easily, but the rift is deeper now. On certain days in the late afternoon, when she has finished her laundry, when the sheets are starched, ironed, folded, tagged, and she is down in the cellar wrapping them up in sheets of brown paper, cutting an even edge with a pair of scissors off the roll, she is aware of her body, wrung from the work of the day, her mind so light as if she is drifting at the end of a very long string, brushing into the rafters, the ceiling dust, the creases in the beams where some rogue bird has found its way in and built a nest of mud and straw. She digs the pointed ends of the scissors into her palm. She digs it in hard to draw herself back down. There is a certain kind of grief, she knows, that has no color, that has no smell or sound. Loneliness is not an empty feeling. It has a weight, a texture, like water in the lungs. She can hear them above her through the cracks in the floor. Bridge and Luce, they are upstairs in the kitchen. They keep their talking low. Luce is griping about Honey Lions, how he is cheating them. Luce and Johnny Clyde, how they do all the work, duck all the danger, bring in the load, but he is the one who makes the trade, and what should be a good-sized payoff, he will claim comes in short, and he pays them only a third of that. A third they have to split between them. Cora goes on wrapping the clothes. She folds down the edges of the stiff brown paper. She squares off the ends. She picks through their words, choosing to attach herself to some, enough to make out their sense. She is drawn to her son's voice. He has always been, still is, a falling star in her darkness. He came out of her upside down, his face bruised, the nose squished to the left. He was a blue baby, cord wrapped twice around his neck. He came in winter, hatched like an egg from the snow. As a mite still suckling on her, he would have her breast in his mouth, one huge eye staring up at her. If her hair was loose, he would take a thick strand of it, wind it tight around his fat baby fingers until the fat flesh buckled and turned white. It was how he clung to her that made her heart give in. He has always been the one that she loved most. She knows what he does, and she considers it a sour business. She has noticed, too, that it does not bring the flush and easy dollars they all talk about. For so much trouble, so much risk, it might bring enough to eat a little better, to buy a little more, but it does not bring so much. She sends him luck. She washes blessings here and there into his clothes. She will sit sometimes in the early morning when the house is still, and she will finger the soiled clothes he has left for her in a pile by the stairs outside his room. She will see into the dark, low places of his thoughts, and she will put those clothes to soak in the hottest water. She will boil them 2 minutes longer than she would boil a sheet. She will try to scald the bad thoughts out of them. She will battle them into the wash until the water is full of those thoughts. Her hands, her mind, full of them. Then she will rinse in something pure. She will touch the edge of a sleeve, a trouser cuff. She will tuck something good into a pocket, a hem, a seam. She hears the scrape of a chair on the floor above her, steps across the kitchen, the clatter of dishes in the sink. They go out. The door shuts behind them. Cora goes upstairs. Through the window she can see them walking down the drive in the direction of the road. She can see the weak glow of the lamp in the shop. Her father passes across the open door and out of view. She slips out of the house and walks north. She cuts around the garden and crosses the wagon path onto the land next door owned by Owen Wales. She walks through the woods down to the lower cornfield, its dead stalks plowed, seeded already with winter rye. It is almost dusk. The cows from the lower pastures have been herded up to the barn for their night milking. A few heifers left. They watch her from the other side of the split-rail fence. Down below is the river. She walks in circles around the field. She keeps to the perimeter, her thoughts pushing her on, her thoughts of her children, Luce and Bridge, her other child, the lost Rose, some thoughts of how she had loved the river once. Long back at one point when she was a girl, she'd prayed every night to the fields and the trees and the stones. Once long back, water was many things to her, the river many things. It was freedom, redemption, the washing away of grief and violence and sin, an easy source of joy. And then it was lost in the shuffling of marriage, pregnancy's birth, swaddling clothes, the shuffle of long winters, fire stews, baking breads, making beds, making dew, swollen breasts, sore legs, chilblained hands, the shuffle of linens and overalls, tubs of wash, tubs of bluing, tubs of the rinse, the shuffle of days and deaths and years. Her feet quicken as she walks. They skim the uneven ground. She has never been able to keep her thoughts settled. They run like wild horses through her brain. She notices from a distance how her awareness shifts through the different stages of the circle. The soft wind strikes her face, then it is behind her. The light half of the sky by her shoulder, her head cocked slightly to one side, waiting, listening for the sounds under the earth, the burrowing of rabbits and moles, the slow push of water returning to its source deep beneath the soil. She counts the loops she makes until she loses count, until her awareness drops away and she has the sense that she is standing in the middle of the field, and the horses in her mind are at the end of a long tether, and she is holding them. She is taming them. They still run the loop around the edge while she stands out of her body in the center. Through the soles of her feet, she can feel the distant thunder of their hooves. Any questions? Yeah.
Well, I also, because I just read Game of Secrets, your prose really has the precision of poetry. Do you have any kind of background in poetry?
Yeah, I wrote poetry all my life. So
Really?
I always, I feel like that's my first impulse as a writer, has always been as a poet. So I have that attention to, to language and cadence and I do actually work, I rework, every book, kind of stripping it back. So hopefully it will have that spareness, that kind of bone spareness of poetry. But I wrote poetry for years growing up. I mean, that was always what I did first. I wrote occasional short stories when I was a little kid, but then actually didn't write a short story until last month. I'm writing my first short story in my, adult, life as a writer. It was always, whenever I wrote short, it was always poems. And when I was in college, I studied poetry with Seamus Heaney, and then I took poetry workshops after. And then I started writing a really, really, really long poem that was about 120 pages of a poem that began to kind of take on a different shape and became ultimately a novel. And what I realize now, kind of understanding, who I am as a writer and what I love, what really drives me about writing is, even though I read poetry, like when I'm between novels or when I'm, when I need that kind of respite, it's poetry I go to. But I love stories. To me, the thrill of a well-told story, that's how I make sense of my world. So I think that's why poetry will never be really what I do and put out to the world. It might be kind of like my dark room, my private space. But I love stories, writing them, reading them. I love that sense of being snapped awake or being kept awake.
Well, it's a pleasure to read prose like that.
Yeah,
so.
Thanks.
Great.
So Dawn, what's the creative process between, like, there's enough life distractions, right?
Yeah.
So if you're working on a project, we'll call it a project, a book, right?
Yeah.
And you have a flash for an idea for the next book.
Right.
How do you keep away from that, or do you?
I try to keep away from it, and then there's some flashes when you get them that you can walk away from, and then there's some flashes you get them you can't, and then the act of sort of pushing them away becomes more work than actually just getting at least the beginning of things out on paper. So when I'm focused on a novel, I tend to be very monogamous with my novels, that I'm only working on one at a time. But for example, this short story that I recently had, I mean, it was exactly what I wanted to do, and I knew I wanted to do it, and it would probably take me 2 to 3 weeks, and I put the novel, down, and wrote this thing, and I needed to write it, and interestingly enough, when I went back to the novel that I'm working on now, which is not set in Westport, it clarified for me. So I think it's having that happen enough to know when you need to, when you can put it aside, but sometimes you just can't, and when you can't, then you need to go with that, because that's a vein that you need to go into.
Isn't there a risk of getting caught up in that, or do you just write down ideas?
Yeah, write down ideas, write down sort of the bones of it. It depends on how long it is. I mean, I might get an idea for another novel, in which case I'll sketch out the ideas, but I won't necessarily let myself, go full force into it. The story was something I could, because I knew it would probably take me 2 to 3 weeks to write it.
And beside a publisher deadline, do you have a schedule for yourself? Like, how do you work?
Yeah, I write every day. I try not to write on the weekends, because that's when my kids are around, and they're going to be, they're 11 and 6 now, and next week they're going to be 17, because it happens like that. And so I try to be present for them as much as I can, because I only get that time with them once. But I find that for me, when I say I try not to work on the weekends, like I mean that. So for me, I've never had the issue of having to force myself to my desk to work on something. Like I'm very driven. And I've always been driven, and that's a good thing, and that's also it's got its pitfalls. So what I find is harder is often taking that space away, taking that time away from my work, and setting it down.
Yeah. So a typical, last question,
Yeah.
it's kind of cliche, but for
Typical
most
day?
For most creative people, you can find a more productive part of the day.
Right.
Right? Do you find that?
Yeah. The most productive time of day for me is usually late at night or super early in the morning, because now I have an 11-year-old and a 6-year-old. Late at night, I'm usually asleep by 9. so that's kind of out. But really first thing in the morning, usually, and I'm good. I've now developed that morning. But when I can wake up at 5 and I can hit my work, for an hour and 15 minutes before everyone else gets up, that period of time works for me.
Well,
if I could even get up a little earlier, it would be even better. Yeah. But I also find that there's some things I can live without. Sleep is not one of them. Like, I'm not one of those people that can function well on 5 hours of sleep. I wish I was.
Well, you're a runner too, right? So
yeah.
That's got
yeah. And that does, yeah. When I take my time in the morning, I usually run in the morning. And that time too is where, actually, Season of Open Water, I haven't talked about this for a while. It came, I had not sold Moontide yet. I finished it. I actually finished it a week after my first son was born, because I knew if I didn't finish it then, I would never be able to finish it. So I finished it, sent it out, but I didn't have a publisher. I didn't have an agent. And I had this other story I wanted to tell about the girl unnamed who rode shotgun with the rummies. So I started writing it when the baby was sleeping. And then when he was old enough, towards the late spring, early summer, I would go for 2-hour, 3-hour walks. And I wrote most of the early material for this on Post-its, like pushing the baby jogger, scribbling, talking to myself. Yeah, walking. Luckily, we have an access road that runs behind the dunes, so I didn't have to worry about vehicles.
They have voice recorders.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what? I can't do this. I hit that button, and it's like everything goes. Yeah. Like, for me, the act of writing... No, but it's an interesting question. Some writers can record. Some writers can, create right on the computer. I don't. I do everything longhand.
So you weren't writing seeds of ideas. You were actually writing...
I was writing fragments of ideas, but usually I don't necessarily write scenes of ideas. So I don't write ideas for scenes. Basically,
no, but seeds. Sorry, seeds.
Yes,
okay,
yeah. Basically, what I write is sort of like fragments of scenes. Okay. So like the beginning of a conversation, or like the heat of a moment that I know is going to take place at some point in the story. And then when we sold Moontide, my husband took about 6 months away from his work, took the baby, and I wrote. I had my box of Post-its, and it's funny because that experience taught me a lot. That experience is when I knew that this is what I was going to do, regardless of whether or not I had the time to do it. Is when you're writing on Post-its and you're compiling them all, in a box. And they're all stuck together, because it's the Post-its, right? It's got the sticky stuff, so that's all one scene. Everything's green and sticking together. So, yeah.
Did you ever consider writing in first person? Because...
Yeah.
Okay.
So in Game of Secrets, there is some of the chapters are told first person. The novel I'm working on now is one point of view, one point of view, one character, female character, and it's all first person. And it doesn't shift point of view. It's a complete departure for me. It's also a psychobiographical novel. It's about a historical figure. So all of that is new as well. Okay. It took an amazing amount of time to research. I'm still reeling from that. Yeah. But it's fun. I am loving first person more than I expected that I would. Yeah. But I think I needed to work in third person for a while in order to, there's a certain muscle that you hone with voice that you can hone in third person that I think is harder to really learn the, I don't know, the range and laws of. So for me, that was just true in my experience.
Yeah, a question about the poetic quality of your prose. Do you read everything aloud as you're editing?
Yeah, and I do now, and I learned that I do because I had like 2 or 3 days when I was taking my boys to school and I was staying, and so I just work in the library, and I suddenly realized there's like 4 or 5 like teenage girls like laughing at me. I'm like, what am I doing? And I realized it's because I talk out loud when I write, but I didn't know that. I didn't used to. So what I find is, yeah, as I'm creating, I'm reading aloud. And I don't even necessarily, I'm not even aware of it. Yeah, so now I don't work in libraries for the most part.
After, with all the interviews of these various characters, I'm wondering about voice. I mean, did you come to the voice of these different points of view with a particular character or voice in mind, or were you able to create those out of whole
You mean
cloth?
a particular, when you say all of the interviews and the stories of, you mean the people that I interviewed?
Right.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, your characters. In other words, you.
How did those interviews shape the voices in the
voices
stories?
of the characters.
That is a really good question. There's definitely, and particularly in my third novel, Game of Secrets, I feel that a number of the voices, they're not based on people. I mean, I'm very strict that way with myself. It's kind of like my one, that I'm extremely strict with that. Like, I never base a character on a person in real life because I just don't feel, I wouldn't like it if somebody did that to me. And so I just don't feel like that's my place to do that. That said, all of those conversations, there's certain things that you pick up, whether it's idioms, that are very specific to a place, whether it's, and figures of speech that are old, that are out of use now, but that were commonplace, back in that period of time. Those are things that all find their way into, into the novels. So I don't know if that's necessarily the answer to your question, because basically what you're asking is, did you base the voices of these characters on people that you interviewed? And no, because Noel actually is, he was inspired by my grandfather, whose middle name was Noel, and he was Australian, and he was not a boat builder. But his personhood, his essence, which really, for me, drove a lot of the creation of the story, even though he's not necessarily the primary character, he drove he really drove the story for me. And so it wasn't based on, the way Noel talks wasn't based on how he talked. But it's interesting you bring up voice, because the other thing that I've come to feel as a novelist, and when I read other works and when I read my own work, is that I think voice is probably the most important piece of any story. I think it's this piece that we don't really talk about because it's really hard to pin down. I mean, I recently was looking into this because I'm thinking about creating a panel for a writing conference on voice, because a lot of people will describe voice as style. I don't really feel like it is style. Style is something you can tinker with. Style is something that you can fix. Voice is not something you can fix or tinker with. It's either there or it's not. You can't really teach it. I think you can free it, but you can't really teach someone how to acquire it. I know with the novel I'm working on now, it took me about 9 months to find the voice of the story. And it wasn't until I found the voice of the story that I could really sit down and write it.
Well, that's what I was thinking about, because if you use the first person, it's mostly one voice.
Right.
It may be hard to find it, but it's one voice.
But when you have it, you know it.
That's you do. I guess you do.
Yeah. Well, but a reader, and you do.
And
Readers feel that.
Doesn't work.
When something doesn't feel quite there, that question of voice is, and so it's become fascinating to me. Saul Bellow has a really, because like I say, I've been looking into this, Saul Bellow has a really interesting description of voice as that really undefinable, unpin downable essence that is partly of the writer, you know, that unmistakable kind of tone and essence of the writer, but it's also partly of the story. You know, I would hesitate to say it's all coming from the writer, but you really feel it in a work when it's there.
And did you feel with the two that were told in the third person and from different points of view, did you feel as if the voices of those, the sort of underlying voice, perceptive voice, or whatever you would call it,
right,
did they seem to be similar, or do you think there was something about the story that
between the two, between Moontide and Season of Open Water, that are both told all third person?
Right.
Yep. Yeah, no, they're slightly different, definitely, because Moontide has a more dreamlike quality. It definitely has a different sense of pace. It's a much slower read. Season of Open Water is a very fast read, and I think because of the, you know, it's been the novel that I've written that's appealed the most to men, because it has a really strong, there is a, you know, the action in it is, and my editor loved it, you know, for that reason, like loved that, you know, the scenes, the chase scenes, and some of the weapon scenes, right? So, and it has a different, it has a grittier, you know, sensibility. Right. That's a good question. Should I read one more short section? Yeah? Okay. Well, you know what? Speaking of... Okay. Why don't we read a little rum running piece? So this is Luce. And this is when he's still working for Honey Lions and really starting to resent it. It was a broken trip. One turn of bad luck after another. It had started out well enough. A dark night, a flat sea. They were going out for a prepaid pickup. Luce had his torn half of a playing card in his left trouser pocket, a 7 of spades. Johnny Clyde had pushed them off at 6 from the Point Wharf, and a Coast Guard patrol, docked at the river mouth, sighted them, then pushed off on their tail. Luce was used to the dance by now. The picket boat would shadow them a ways, then turn back and head in toward shore to regroup with the rest of the blockade. Except on that night, for some reason, she didn't. It grew dark, and still she followed them, out past the inner Mayo ledge, out past the sow and pigs, 10, 12, 14 miles out. This was not what they had expected, not what they wanted. Luce knew he couldn't lead her any farther on. He was tired already. He had worked 4 out of the past 5 nights. The night before, he had worked until dawn. He had slept through the early afternoon in his bed at home, but his sleep had been rough and fitful. He had a handful of coffee beans in his coat pocket. He pulled a few out and gnawed on them to keep himself sharp as he tooled back and forth in the fringe of deeper water off a shoal, trying to decide what course to take. He kept his lights on. He made it easy for the patrol boat to keep him in sight. He even had Johnny Clyde throw out 2 trolling lines to pretend they were trying the fishing. Johnny's hands shook, and he fouled up one of the lines. He smoked one cigarette after another. He drew in deep on them, and they burned fast down to his fingers. He set the fishing poles into metal clasp holders, then leaned against the side of the wheelhouse, still smoking. The fishing lines trailed after them through the rip, skinny threads, long and taut and silver when they caught the light. The sea had begun to build, gentle swells running a good 3 or 4 feet. Luce headed out again, but off his intended course, away from the location of the rum ship. He headed west-southwest. He picked up speed, and at one point he thought he had lost the patrol, but as he gained the crest of a swell, he looked back and glimpsed the top of her pilot house, several troughs behind, before she folded back down again into a sea. He made a wide circle then, slow and leisurely. He cut back over his own wake and veered in, heading north, back toward shore. "Where are you going, Luce?" Johnny asked. "What are you doing?" Luce didn't answer. He gave the engine more gas. As Johnny went to light another cigarette, the nose of the boat struck a wave. Water splashed over the foredeck, and Johnny stumbled, nearly losing his balance. He grasped for the side of the wheelhouse. The match flailed on his shirt and he beat it out. Whoa, man, easy. I almost set myself afire. Keep it out, Luce said. Don't light up. He didn't look back, but he knew the picket boat was still on their heels and coming closer now. With the rougher sea, she did not want to lose them. The wind was at his back and he could hear her engines running. He steered around the shoal. He kept tight against the ledge in the calmer water. Hugging the reef, then he cut east-northeast, but still setting an apparent course toward shore. The ledge ended and they moved out again into deeper water in the high, steep running swells outside the shoal. Again at the top of a crest, Luce glanced back over his shoulder, and he could see the cutter's lights and the square-cut shape of her wheelhouse. He kept his eye on her as she climbed, then dipped down and disappeared. And when she was gone, when he could not see her, and when he knew she could not see him, he cut off his lights. He swerved south. He counted under his breath. Then, estimating he was well beyond her, he cut off his engine. They went still in the water, drifting up over the black and rolling sea. What, said Johnny Clyde, what are you doing? Shh, hissed Luce. Nothing. Say nothing, not a sound. And they hung there, the soles of their feet locked to the floor of the boat, in that cold, dark silence rocking over the waves. The cutter passed north of them, and Luce could not hear her engines. He kept his eye on her running lights, bobbing up and down. She threw a searchlight, harsh and white and sudden. The light in bright narrow circles at first, then broader, picking up nothing, skimming out across the dark and empty sea. Luce waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. He waited until she gave up, and the light went out, and there was no sign of her. He started up the engine and kept her on low. He veered around and ran back along the ledge, heading seaward. Twice looking back, he thought he had a glimpse of the cutter, a distant running light, far, far north of them. She seemed to be edging slowly west. He set a straight course out, south-southeast. He ran the boat without lights, climbing the waves, sledding down their backsides. He let Johnny Clyde light up a cigarette. He even took one himself, but the smoke dulled his mind. He stubbed it out. They meet up with the ship, an old whaling bark, the Alexandra. She is scarred, an archaic hull, her sails patched. They come on her sooner than they expect to. She is not in safe waters. She is anchored just inside the limit, and Luce warns the first mate. Someone must have made a mistake, Luce says lightly. The mate shoots him a dark look. Your mistake. Fine then, Luce says, and shrugs. He hands the mate his half of the 7 of spades, and the mate matches it with the captain's half of the same torn card. 3 men of the crew are sent down into the hold to drag up their order. 60 cases of scotch and 10 of champagne. Luce is edgy the whole time they are on board. He stays close to the rail, leaning against it. He keeps checking the sea, but there is no sign of another boat, no sign of a light, no sign of any other living, moving shape. He casts an eye across the Alexandra, her deck, her cargo, her crew. She is shabby and ill-kept, but he spies the long, bony shadows of submachine guns hidden in the furled sails. They load up and push off. He has the engine on low, and as he turns her around to head in toward shore, the wind strikes the back of his neck, and he has the faint, sick sense of something altered, something wrong. At first he cannot say what it is, nothing he hears, nothing he sees, but then he smells the slight reek of gasoline on the clean, salt wind. He cuts off his running lights. He can see her then, the cutter patrol. Right away he recognizes her by her lines, her sleek, lean profile low in the water. She is nearly on them. The sound rips open the darkness, the sharp, shrill blow of the klaxon horn, ordering him to heave to. A moment later, the cutter throws her searchlight. Luce swerves hard out of the light's path, but it nicks his stern. He hears the shout. He shifts into reverse, swings right, pulls around, then gives both engines the gun. He speeds straight through the line of the searchlight, his head down. The light strikes the wheelhouse, then the side of his face, white, blinding. He looks away, and they fall back into the darkness. He hears the shouts of the Coast Guard men behind him. He heads straight for the Alexandra. Her crew is in motion now, alert to the danger, men shuffling on her deck, hauling anchor, hoisting sail, pulling out their guns. He can hear the groan of the chain through the hawse-pipe. He speeds toward her, the cutter's searchlight still tailing him, groping through the churned sea of his wake. He has almost reached the Alexandra's stern when the patrol boat fires a burst of warning shots. They have aimed ahead of him, but his speed takes him through the blaze of machine gun fire. Bullets rake the wheelhouse, and he feels the shift in air as one passes close to his ear. The sound intimate, deafening. His heart stops. Down, he shouts to Johnny Clyde. Flat on the deck, down! He veers hard and fast around the Alexandra to make a shield between himself and the patrol. He knows that he is not the big fish they are after. He was the bait, and they trailed him out. They must have known ahead of time she would be off position. Someone must have set her up. It was his dumb luck to be caught in the middle of it. He turns again to the right and guns both engines. He heads straight out, toward nothing, running without lights as hard and fast as the boat will take him into the great black rolls of the sea. Any other questions before we wrap up? Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of dramatis personae, I sense that the father of the family is missing.
Yes.
Is he there? Is he absent?
No,
is he
flu.
dead?
He died in the flu epidemic, which was a big epidemic. Yeah. That it was estimated it took more than the war, actually. Yeah. Yeah, so he's missing. Yeah, sure.
I think it's maybe in the first chapter you actually define the season of open water. Can you just tell us
About what that?
Yeah.
So the season of open water is a period in the Arctic, and it was well known in Arctic whaling, but it's still well known as this period when the when things soften and melt, and the leads widen, and the there's the opportunity for life to really take hold and take shape in the Arctic. And the in the novel, that's actually, it's funny you say that, because that's actually, I feel like in this book there are a few sections where as a writer, I think like there's a few sections where you feel like, oh, that's the best writing I've ever done, at that point, right? So there's a passage later on in the novel that talks about what the season of open water means in the emotional life of these characters, and what the season of open water means, in the thematic, overall, narrative arc of this story. And it's one of my it's one of the passages where I feel like I really got it. Yeah. And it was funny because I wrote that, my editor actually noticed it. She's like, I think these 3 pages are, these 3 pages are the pages I can't, forget. And I remember when I sat down to write Game of Secrets, that I said, I held those 3 pages up in my mind. Like, I really want to strive, as I move forward as a writer, to really write, toward, to being able to write, 320 pages, out of that place. So the season of open water for the characters, I know for Noel, season of open water, he describes to Bridge that it's that period of time in your life that's like summer. It's kind of like that season of your life that for him he looks back on, and he remembers, but it still sort of sheds meaning, into his life and his future, as it what it is now. And then for Bridge, also there is a love story in this novel. You wouldn't know it from the chapters I read, but there is a love story in this novel, and he and his granddaughter Noel and Bridge do connect around what that love story means to her, and he wants to tell her, that's that place where things kind of soften and open, and you need to be there for that and present. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawn. It was so nice to have you
Thank
back.
you so much for having me.
And Dawn will be signing both The Season of Open Water and Game of Secrets. And before you jump up for that, let me just tell you what we have going on next Sunday. April is National Poetry Month.